Good afternoon. Philanthropy is private action in public space. In an increasingly political and media-intensive world, what governance, what accountability, what transparency, and what attitude is appropriate and right for charitable organizations and private philanthropy? Good afternoon. My name is Peter Karoff, and on behalf of the Philanthropic Initiative, welcome to our third Tuesdays at TPI conference, which today is on the subject of trust and transparency. The Tuesdays at TPI series is the latest in 15 years of TPI's efforts to reflect upon and bring to serious discussion important issues facing the field of philanthropy as it relates to the world in which we live. Last October's Tuesdays at TPI conference was on the subject of politics, policy, and philanthropy, a subject very much related to today's. The journal edition of TPI's newsletter Initiatives that covers that conference and expands on that is now on our website. And that conference, by the way, is also viewable on the WGBH Forum website. We're very pleased that TPI is a partner with GBH and that GBH is filming today's session as well, because it will then be available to others who want to look at this who could not join today for a period of 3 years. Our goals in this series are to dig a little deeper, to generate and disseminate new ideas, and to provide a forum for peer learning, to break down barriers between perception and reality, and above all, to be a truth teller. Are you ready, panel, to be truth tellers? Because that's our task. And for TPI, this is not a passive matter. We work every day with real donors who care a great deal about this world and who want to do the right thing. And today, that is not simple. This afternoon, we have a global audience of about 100 to 125 people, with a group of 30 to 45 people here in Boston in the aptly named Immersion Theater. So panelists, we're ready. And it's interesting, by the way, in terms of where people are. I want to just say hello to a few people, to Robert in Sarasota, to Glenn in Charlotte, North Carolina, to Allison in Washington, D.C., to Jerry in Phoenix, to Nathan in Toronto, to Amy in Philadelphia, to Angela in Grand Rapids, to Rebecca and Cora in Madison, Wisconsin. So we are really interested in welcoming all of you. And in addition, we're hopeful that we can make this into a more interactive and participatory session than is typical. And before we begin, a big thank you to the Citigroup Private Bank Philanthropic Advisors for sponsoring this conference, and to Claire Costello, who heads that effort. We are very, very appreciative of that support. First, a few rules for this high-tech web conference game that has the objective of making you guys in the global audience as much or even more of a player as those of us here in the Immersion Theater in Boston. And you should now have on your computer screen some instructions, but during the discussion, you can send a question or a comment to the panel or to a specific panelist. And to send a question, please type it into the small dialog box at the bottom of your screen and then click on send. If you want to send it to a specific panelist, to Bill or to Peter or to Marion or to Dot, you can type their name at the beginning of the question. Please keep them short, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can. We're also going to do some polling. We're going to basically ask those in our global audience and those here to answer a set of 3 questions. And to test that, I'm going to begin with a question. Here's the question. How many of you this morning were nice to your spouse, your partner, your dog, or your cat? Yes or no? How many in the theater were nice? Oh, everybody was nice. And now Peter Goldmark, who in addition to being a panelist is supposed to be looking at the screen, how many out there in outer land said they were nice?
On my screen, 2 said yes and 1 said no.
Oh, my God. Well, I don't know, web group, but that's the gist of it. Now, why have we chosen the subject of trust and transparency? The essay on trust that served as the white paper for this conference and that you have all seen makes the case that the crisis in trust that is endemic across every domain in our society has now reached the heretofore unassailable mountaintop of philanthropy. Is that correct, Dot? Unassailable? Have you been unassailable?
No, I'm afraid not.
Well, in the essay, I quote Fred Miller, who's one of the deans of nonprofit consulting. When trust is lost, he said, what is at risk is the potential loss of an organization's franchise to operate. Interesting comment. And one of our objectives today is to explore whether our philanthropic franchise overall is truly at risk. And let me now turn to our panel and do very brief introductions. They're going to be brief because you have the material, and in addition, they're all so well known. Here's the question I'm going to ask our panelists to answer in about 3 sentences. What do you think, when you think about the issue of trust as it relates to philanthropy, what are the first things, the most important things that come to your mind? Peter Goldmark, former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, publisher of the International Herald Tribune, currently working in the environmental area at Environmental Defense. Peter?
I will take trust in the broadest sense. The trust we each hold as a human being to manage ourselves with some wisdom and restraint and civility and culture and foresight on this small planet. And I will take the endeavor secured by that trust in its broadest sense to be philanthropy. And the trust I would therefore hope to earn as I act, either institutionally or individually, is the confidence that I can discharge that broader obligation wisely.
Thank you. Alec Jones, welcome. The head of the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School, a distinguished Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the author of, with Susan Tift, of 2 major books on American dynasty families, the Binghams and the Salzburgers. Alec?
Thank you, Peter. I come at this from a somewhat different perspective, perhaps because of my background as a journalist. I think that the issue is not so much the creeping distrust as it is the enormously increased sense of the power of the institutions we're talking about. I think for most people, the nonprofit world is looked at as a whole. I know that this group is looking at private philanthropy in particular. But I think if you look at the way the world is functioning now, NGOs of all kinds, private philanthropy, nonprofits, foundations, they're all put together, and they all are viewed, I think, increasingly as the vehicle for doing things that government seems increasingly unlikely or unable or unwilling to do. And with that power has come the kind of scrutiny that goes with power. I think it's very much the same kind of scrutiny that has been given to the media as its perceived power has grown. It's very much, I think, the way Ronald Reagan said it, trust but verify, and I think that that's as American and old-fashioned as apple pie.
Thank you, Alec. Marion Fremont Smith, a distinguished scholar in this field for many years, a senior fellow at the Hauser Center, the author of a new book that will be out next month, Governance of Nonprofit Organizations, Foundations, in Federal and State Law and Regulation. I garbled the title, but it's Harvard Press. We're delighted that Marion is here. She's been an observer of this scene for a long time and has an interesting perspective.
I do come at this as having been a writer and researcher, but also as a practitioner, as a legal advisor to philanthropic nonprofit organizations and individuals. From that perspective, I look at trust not as an issue, but as a relationship that demands the greatest highest adherence to standards of fair dealing and prudence. In return for that expectation from those who manage philanthropy, society has given the sector a very wide degree of freedom to choose purposes and to carry out missions, and also very important tax incentives for support. If the stewards of philanthropy do not adhere to these standards, the society is not going to continue to provide that support. The issue then to me is how we devise ways to preserve these advantages and assure compliance with these high standards, but ways which do not impinge unnecessarily on the freedom that we all enjoy, as I say, to carry out mission.
Thank you, Marion. Scott Harshbarger, former Attorney General in Massachusetts, candidate for governor in Massachusetts, president of Common Cause, and an associate partner of Murphy, Hess, Toomey, and Lehane law firm. Scott.
Thank you for getting my law firm name in. I appreciate that. I just incorporate by reference all these brilliant comments that were made ahead of me. I have, though, the three sentences I would use about this issue are, one, I equate trust with integrity, with the integrity of the governance process. And that's a system of leadership. It's not about individuals. It's about how the institution functions. And so it must function with a level of integrity, and you trust that sense of integrity. The challenge, of course, is how you measure that. Potter Stewart is always used, has been quoted to say, the fact that you may have the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And therefore the challenge for those that seek this institution of trust, and therefore some freedom from usual accountability of the outside, is, how do you measure what you're doing? Ultimately, for me, it is also about democracy. It is every institution has some responsibility to the broader community. How are they fulfilling that? And who is to hold them accountable for doing that? That whole combination of cluster of things is how you feel there's a measure of trust in the institution, and we have failed in many parts of our society. And I think today that's the great challenge to the nonprofit system. We have failed to articulate the values and expectations and how we're going to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Scott. Dot Ridings, who has the very simple job of being president of the Council on Foundations in an era of great calm, has been on the hot seat since she arrived out of a distinguished career as a publisher in the newspaper world, and has been, if you will, on the hustings on this subject around the country. Dot.
And that travel is just beginning. There are more than a few of us recovering journalists on this panel.
I noticed that.
And I certainly tuned in to what Alex said about the relationship to power and reaction to power. The newspaper business obviously has suffered enormously over the period of years. I know there's an old story that we were taught supposedly in journalism school that when your mother says she loves you, check it out, indicating the lack of trust that people are who they say they are or what they say they are. And I fear, though, that the bottom line is that indeed we are entering an era of increased lack of trust in philanthropy in general, in the not-for-profit sector in general, and a lot of it is related to just what Alex said as well.
Thank you, Dot. John Abele is the founder-chairman of Boston Scientific and the donor to the Argosy Foundation, with a great deal of passion around issues relating to educating and to conferencing, has been a mentor to the Tuesdays at TPI series. John.
I think Peter made a little comment that is worthwhile following up, and that is you have trust of organization, you have trust of individuals, you have trust of program, and as organizations get bigger, the likelihood that one individual that you don't trust can color your view of the entire organization is a bit of a dilemma. So size is a dilemma. At our our organization, I'll leave it at that, we have what we call the 60-minute rule. And the 60-minute rule is if you're talking to an individual, be it an employee or a vendor or a client or a patient or whatever it might be, and there's a sense that there needs to be discretion involved, be prepared to explain your discussion to Mike Wallace tonight on television. I guess that's sort of the public administrator's guideline that is part of life. I have a variation to that, which is if what you are involved in and you've got a project and it sounds great but certain things happen and it starts to sound like a skit from Saturday Night Live, that's probably not going to pass the trust test either. And sometimes we get into that. We can't afford that. So bottom line, it's kind of walk the talk, and that's the challenge we all have.
Thank you, John. Bill Pounds, Dean Emeritus of the MIT Sloan School of Management, a person with more experience on corporate boards and nonprofit boards than almost anyone I know. Bill Pounds.
After all these years, I should know better than to come last on a panel. I could simply second the thoughts of all my distinguished colleagues, but of course I won't. I was asked to think of three things that come to mind. Being a professor, I've thought of three questions that comes to mind with respect to the matter of trust as it relates to philanthropy. I come pretty close to Scott, I'm afraid. Do I trust the integrity of the donor's intent? Do I trust the integrity and effectiveness of those employed to carry out that intent? Do I trust the integrity and willingness to act of those responsible for overseeing the program? Those are the three things I think of.
Interesting set of comments. Do we have a question from the audience in regard to any one of these comments? I was struck by the sense of inevitability that almost everyone on the panel expressed. In essence, no surprise here. There can't be. We're not a small enterprise. We're a large enterprise. So what's all the surprise? Very interesting. Any questions at this point? Microphone to David Ford.
To any of you, do you think there's more abuse in our sector than there is in journalism or business or carpentry?
The question was, do you think there's more abuse in our sector as there is in business or carpentry or anything? That was a question for the audience that might not have heard it.
I'll respond, if I may, on behalf of journalism. I think that the answer, you didn't ask about plumbing, of course. I don't know how that would fit, but I think that there is still for this sector a resilient and enduring and genuine kind of trust that is there still that's in the same manner that people in a small town give their local newspaper. It can be dissipated, it can be destroyed even, especially if it's abused. But I think that is something that for most people is still, it's still there. So, whether the reality of the human beings involved is any different, I think institutionally and as a sector, this sector has something still to preserve rather than simply to rebuild.
John?
The question I had was, when you look at trust, is it point number one or point number two from Bill's point? In other words, integrity of intent, you can have trust, but if they don't have the capability to carry it out, and I think there's much more of that with regard to the philanthropic institutions, so the intent may be good, and I think that's a question I have. And the larger the institution, the more I think there's a sense of concern about it.
John?
I don't know, David, if there's more than those other endeavors that you mentioned or in any other field. But I can tell you there's a whole lot more than we thought there was even a year ago. We've always been aware. I'm speaking on now for the Council on Foundations, which has a number of members who each year say they will abide by our principles and practices. They say they will each year when they pay their dues. And there are members that we have quietly dropped from membership because they were not living up to what our expectations were, even at a minimal level. But we really didn't think there was the enormous amount that I think has been exposed, and not just by newspapers, but by closer looking at the 990s that we now can all look at over a period of recent years, and through other evidence that we have. I certainly, when I came to the council 8 years ago, I had no idea that there was the kind of either wrong-headed or deliberate or just ignorant kind of error that was going on within philanthropy and indeed within the charitable sector. Then I am now convinced that there is. Still not predominant, but it's sizable.
I have some interesting observations about this that came from a survey that I conducted with a colleague at Harvard. We looked and published last year a survey of press reports of wrongdoing by charities from 1995 to 2002, and we looked through LexisNexis, which covers newspapers, large numbers of them, and the other parts of the media. And that survey came up with 104 criminal cases and 54 cases of what we called breach of fiduciary duty, and it involved organizations across the board. We have just finished putting together numbers for 2003, and as you know, there has been a major new interest in this issue in the press, spurred, I think, in large part originally by the debate over the payout rule that occurred last summer. Remember, I had 54 cases over 5 years. We have a total for 2003 of 74 cases reported. Now, 38 of those are press allegations only. The others involved state action. They involved whether it's the Attorney General or the Internal Revenue Service, and a lot of them, because it's new, are still under investigation. But clearly this signals something to us that we need to be aware of.
Bill?
Dot, I thought I'd ask you to make a comment on your thought. Yeah. We all face these dilemmas when we come across something we're concerned about. But it struck me when you said that you quietly dropped some people. Should you quietly drop them or not?
Probably not. Now, I'm speaking a little bit out of turn because my board is working on this right now. Our process up to this point has been to do it quietly.
We all do that. I'm not. This is not critical,
yeah.
But I often think that when you come across this, it's perhaps not completely fair to be quiet.
I think you're absolutely right, and I have absolutely no doubt that we're going to be changing that, but it's in the process right now, so I don't want to step out too far ahead.
I understand.
Scott?
Let me just make a little bit more critical observation. I don't think there's any more in this sector. I think there's a lot of self-righteousness, though, and there's been a willingness to ignore this and almost to view yourself as being immune. We did see that to some extent in corporate America, the denial. There was just a few bad apples when what really had happened was a massive breakdown in self-regulation, a massive ethical breakdown, in large measure over a period of time because of the lack of accountability, I think. So I think that one of the issues here is this deafening silence from the leadership of all the sectors affected. The leadership has almost come to it only after forced to come to it. We're now, because the press is out there, because people have been energized, now the leadership is speaking to this. But as Peter said earlier, remember, he said about inevitability. This has been going on. These patterns are not new. But I do think the thing I see, I think it's every sector. I think the public sector has been held to a much higher standard and a double standard by each of the other sectors. We have things that happen in the public sector, and I say this with a little bit of defensiveness, are treated as corrupt, inept, incompetent, grounds for censure, indictment, that frankly in the other two sectors have been the same kind of conduct, has been treated at best with silence and often, in many cases, rewarded. So that I think to some extent we're seeing a bit of a leveling of the playing field here. But But the reporting phenomenon doesn't, the numbers should increase. Once you start to report, this is always true. You have a reporting phenomena here, but there's also a window of opportunity if the leadership steps up now, I think.
Always good
Folks,
to have a
I need to
regulator
interrupt.
around.
There is a very literate request from someone in Madison, Wisconsin, that you all speak right into the microphone. They are not getting us all out there.
Thank you very much, Peter. And let's go out to our global audience and to everyone here with a question. And for those on the global audience who may have not heard the introduction here, in order to be able to participate, you're going to have flashed up on your screen a question. In fact, it should be there now.
I'm unable to send a poll right now. I apologize. It'll be just a minute.
All right, it'll be a minute. Let me tell you what the question is, because you can all think about it. What, and those of you in the studio audience, you have this in your packet with the list of with the questions as well as the elements. What, in your view, is the single greatest problem doing the most damage to public trust and philanthropy? Put differently, which of these ills is most responsible for eroding public trust and philanthropy? And then there are several elements: arrogance and hubris, inaccessibility, excessive privacy, poor communication, lack of transparency, foundation immortality, excessive donor control, resistance to collaboration, isolation of funders, inadequate governance, accountability, and standards, excessive trustee compensation, grants made and business conducted in a tight, inscrutable old boy, old girl network. Are we on the web, Cindy? Not yet? All right. I would like to... They have the audio. Then let's go to the audience here. Who would, in looking at this list, nominate one of these to be, in fact, the single greatest problem? And we realize that's unfair. Do we have a nomination from the floor of which of these is, in fact, in your mind, the biggest problem? David Squire, why don't you just yell it out and I'll repeat it.
It seems to me that lack of transparency covers a lot of them. With openness, a lot of it can be overcome.
Lack of transparency has been raised. How many in the room think that is, in fact, the single biggest problem? Raise your hands. And we have had a comment that, in essence, inaccessibility and excessive privacy is perhaps tied in with that. We have a sprinkling of hands that agree that that's the biggest problem. Anyone else in the audience, would you nominate any one of these other elements as being the single biggest issue relevant to public trust? There's another from the back. We have a very smart audience in here which doesn't like our list and thinks, in fact, one of them is suggesting we don't have it all on there. But, of course, we did that very cleverly to allow our panelists to come in and weigh in. But in essence, what has been suggested is that what's not here that's a huge thing is the lack of the differential between the public and private persona.
Could I just add, which I think also relates to the idea of arrogance.
Arrogance,
it's a sort
all
of
right.
sense of unquestioned ability to
Arrogance.
do what you like.
How many think that that area would be, in fact, the single biggest issue? Raise your hand in the audience. These are unfair, of course, because to some degree, nothing is the single biggest. They're related. But go ahead. Ron Gallo from Providence, from Rhode Island Community Foundation.
I was going to nominate arrogance and hubris because I think almost everything else on the list flows from that, including the lack of transparency. And the comment made just prior to mine is why I think there is that arrogance and hubris, because of that lack of distinction between private funds and the fact that foundation funds are no longer really private, but through the tax code are placed in the public trust. And I don't think there's a real reckoning with that.
Thank you very much. All right, panel, while we're waiting for our global audience to be invited in to vote, what are your thoughts about this question? Dot.
Excellent points all. I would point out that the arrogance hubris thing, however, doesn't always apply to the lack of transparency and all those other issues, because there are, and we discover this time and again, we run into folks who really have never had the proper orientation to just what private philanthropy is all about, and it's really rather shocking. There's just an enormous job to be done in terms of education. This isn't a very sexy answer to that question, but there's just an appalling lack of education for an awful lot of folks that underlies some of these things that are done with out of sheer lack of knowledge that it's not that way. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we see as our biggest challenge. Mm-hmm. That we can do something about. I can't do anything about people who are going to cheat. The lawbreakers, they ought to be caught by the law enforcement folks. That's the people who set out to cheat. That's a good correction. We can't do anything about that, but we can do something about the folks who really need to know how to do it right. And that's what our major focus is going to be over the next couple of years.
Scott?
Well, I don't want to be cast totally in the law enforcement role here, but I mean, I think the minute we expect the law and law enforcement to solve these problems, it's a guaranteed disaster. It won't happen. I mean, it doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. The law, as Wendell Holmes want to say, the law was supposed to define the minimum ethic and not the maximum ethic. It was supposed to define the framework in which the people could act out their normative values. So that's what, and that, if you look at what fails in many, is that the minimum threshold fails, and the framework and the lack of enforcement. But within that, Dot, just to your point, we do believe that there are ways to educate and standards of governance and ways in which people are expected to control themselves. And I do think that if the peer pressure, if the standards of the sector don't provide this, the law alone is never going to do it. And I think that my own view about the biggest problem goes right back to this issue of secrecy and lack of transparency and accountability and openness. I think people are amazingly tolerant of people who admit mistakes, people who say what they're going to do and are willing to debate it. People will respect you even if they don't agree. What they often don't, what scares them when it comes down to a crisis is what they don't know, what they don't understand. And then when people even make it more harder, I think this whole thing is about how do you have open and are willing to stand for something, be criticized for it, but stand for something. People will accept and tolerate that a great deal, I think.
Let me just tell you a word about what the people who are listening to us are talking about. One of the things they're talking about is the difference. They're talking among themselves as well as listening to us. One of the things they're talking about is the difference between perceived wrongdoing and actual wrongdoing. Another thing they're talking about is the way in which some of the standards and issues all of you have raised as panelists may apply differently to private foundations, public charities, community foundations, and some of the other subspecies with which we're all familiar. The rough breakdown on the question Peter Karoff originally asked the audience about which one of these factors do you assign a great deal of responsibility to. There is one that is ahead of all of them. It's lack of transparency. And then there are about 5 tied for second. It's a very distinct skewing because after that it falls off to 3 and 2%. And the 5 that are more or less ranked the same after lack of transparency are, in no particular order, excessive donor control, inadequate governance and accountability, and resistance to collaboration, isolation of funders. That one, I can tell that's surprising, Dot, too. That surprises me a little bit.
Interesting. Alec Jones?
I was going to vote for transparency because I think that does cover more of these things than any other. But I think the real issue for trust ongoing is going to be finding ways to make the functions and the product and the thinking of private philanthropy more accessible to a public that may or may not have a huge interest, but is apparently going to be demanding a lot more information than has been there in the past. I'd like to also, suggest that the category of communication not be overlooked, because I think that there, as I said before, there's a lot of good feeling out there. And I think there is an awful lot also, especially when it comes to private philanthropy, of understanding that this is individuals who are putting their own money in, and that they should have some say in how the money is spent, and that they created these foundations for particular purposes, and yes, they are protected in some sense in terms of the tax code, but that there is leeway granted. It's very much, I think, of a piece with the idea that, you know, something like 25% of the American public think they're in the top 10% of wealth. I mean, I think that there's an identification with the idea of philanthropy because it's a generous nation, and that impulse to give is something that people experience for the most part themselves, and they do it entirely at their own discretion. And they're going to give to who they want to give to. And I think that making the connection between that philanthropic individual impulse and the way these organizations run would make it likely that, especially for private foundations, there would be a place for privacy and a place for direction that is you know, personal in many ways, but is still one that satisfies the public and satisfies the media.
Do you think that we operate in philanthropy, and this is to the panel, in an old boy, old girl network, that we really are not accessible? Is accessibility one of the side slants to transparency?
I'll tell you one problem I think from my years as running a large foundation. This is Peter Goldmark, which is a little different Peter Kay. I think a far larger problem than old boy, old girl network is operating in silos. One of the things that really struck me when I was running one of and watching the other large foundations was how little the governing bodies knew about what each other were doing, and how captive they each were of their own CEO and their own internal story, and how little outside information about their own foundation they had. So I think on this one we may be looking down the wrong rat hole.
Comments from anyone else? Bill? Bill Pounds?
Yeah. I'm going to add another one to your list here, Peter, but I think Dot has already mentioned it, and that is, I think corporations have sort of led the way here. Their trust fell off first, and I think there has been enormous progress made in corporate governance in the last few years, growing largely out of people coming together to agree on what the job is. I think most people who are invited to join boards of start with corporations are, first of all, surprised to be asked. Second, hardly ever ask what the job is, and hope that somehow it will be revealed over time. And I think it rarely is revealed, and therefore people don't always know what they're supposed to do. In the case of nonprofits, of course, the issue is not only what you're supposed to do, but what you're supposed to give, in the case of some of them. And the job description of people responsible for making these organizations work is often not even indicated. The pleasure is in having somebody sit in the seat rather than doing the work. And I think organizations like DOTS, to the degree you can begin to generate some guidelines for people as to what their jobs is, you'll find a sharp increase in performance.
Marion?
I wanted to second what Bill just said, because I think there is such wide misunderstanding of the role of boards and the role of organizations. I do think that it's interesting that it's lack of transparency that came up, because we are really at the threshold of a very different era in transparency. We now have available, as you people know, 990 forms on the web, immediately accessible. It is because they are accessible that we have had the Globe stories, the Chronicle on Philanthropy new study of loans, and the Pablo Eisenberg study on trustee fees. And I think we are just at the start of good reporters mining this information, and I think we meaning the philanthropic sector, has not quite absorbed yet what this is going to do. And it makes to me all the more important that we get people to understand what their roles are and how they can be effective. And this is the role for lots of people. It's the role for the state and executives in the Attorney General's office. It's the role for the IRS, and it's a role for the Independent Sector Council on Foundations, and each one of us.
Any questions here in the Immersion Theater on this particular issue? We have one with their hand up. Can we get a microphone to that person? Thank you.
Hi. I just had a comment, and then I wanted to ask a question, particularly of Marion and Scott. I wanted to comment on the Old Girls Network. I don't think that's the issue. I know actually the majority of foundation executive directors, I think, today are women. And if you look at the Council on Foundations data, but when you look at gender diversity on the boards of trustees of foundations, you will not. Well, you won't see enough diversity, period, but you definitely won't see half of them being women if they're going to reflect the overall society. My question was, what is the role of the legal profession here and the financial advisory services world? Most foundations, when they're set up, they're not simple to set up. And I've wondered about all in this, who's giving what advice and what needs to be done to those who are giving advice to be sure that they're promoting the kinds of standards that need to be promoted. And certainly this is the philanthropic initiative aside. But other groups who are really in this business, I agree with Dot, if you're going to cheat, you can find out a way to cheat. But this is a huge industry now of creating private foundations and family foundations. So what does it say about those professionals and what they're doing or what needs to change with them?
We've only got we've got more newspaper people than lawyers, but we've got a few.
I think the professions can do more, clearly. We saw this in the late 60s before the Tax Reform Act was passed, where the accountants and lawyers were urging people to set up foundations so that they could take advantage of them. And that led directly to the 69 Act. I think we're seeing a little bit of that today. It certainly came out, if any of you have seen that study of the Chronicle on Philanthropy, on loans and some supporting organizations that were clearly set up to take advantage of, quote, a loophole to borrow back money that you've given to a foundation that was flaunted by members of the legal profession, I have to say. The tax section of the American Bar Association, we're a very active group of people. We could do more. Mostly our efforts have been aimed at working with the Treasury and the IRS to improve performance. There have been some attorneys general who have made an effort. Massachusetts under Scott, it was a model of this, to conduct conferences to try to educate fiduciaries, to put out a directory, to put out a brochure that talks about the standards of governance, that it's extremely well done. And we just need more of that. And we can't look at the two organizations, which sadly there are only those two in the country that I mentioned, Council on Foundations and the Independent Sector. There needs to be more of that. It needs to be more at the local level. And
Scott, can I slip between you and broaden what Marion said, because there are some things going on out there which I think you're going to want to answer in your response. The whole question of the role of the professional advisors is being talked about by the people listening to us, and one person in particular who obviously works in the financial tax shelter industry is saying, my translation, their thought, look, you guys, there's a whole industry out there that is selling tax shelter, donor control, and estate longevity, and that whole industry knows nothing about philanthropic purpose. So I thought, Scott, in terms of what Marion said, we'd get that out there before you responded.
No, I think that's very important because I want to be, Marion's comment was, as usual, much more balanced and comprehensive here. I want to go answer with one introduction, which goes to Mr. Pound's very interesting point about corporate boards. I think one of the things that we have not just failed to educate people about what their roles are, we have failed in either educating or having a common understanding of what their obligations are. What does it mean to govern, to be on a board? What are your obligations, not just the compensation or the rewards you get, and to whom do you owe those obligations? Now, that, of course, means, by definition, the institute matters a huge amount what the organization is. So the private philanthropy may be quite different than others. But there has not been an effort, but it's this understanding the obligations. And that's why I get back to this. Cheating, stealing, lying, fraud, crimes are not ethical issues. They're just plain illegal. I mean, that's not a question of an ethical issue by definition, at least my definition is, it's within the boundaries of the law. And it's a tension, and you try then to articulate that. And that's what I think the groups are supposed to be doing, is to articulate to people what within the realm of the law can you do. Now, the tricky thing for lawyers is obviously that we're lawyers. We write the law. It's on the one hand. On the other hand, we want to be very, very careful. But we do have a code of professional responsibility, and I think if there's been a missing ingredient in all of the last round of discussion, it has not just been the auditors and the accountants who failed here. I think the lawyers, perhaps taking advantage of confidences and privileges and secrets, that I understand, accept as a very important value. But I think lawyers have missed the other part about the obligation to offer good advice and counsel in the best interest of their client, to report fraud up to the highest level. There's never been a privilege that protects that. And I think the legal profession has a lot of accounting to do here for our failure to not only give legal advice, but to follow the other piece, the counsel, advice and counsel to clients about your role and responsibility. Then if you choose to do something different, that's a different question, whether we'll defend you or not. But there's a broader obligation, not just to advise you as to the limits of the law, but the opportunities you have to do well.
Dot?
I think we probably all agree there's plenty of flagellation to go around among all these groups, but I wanted to speak specifically to the person who wrote in to Peter Goldmark, because that person was right on the money. There is an enormous, relatively new, because of its size, field of activity, endeavors of philanthropic advising. I mean, we've always had them, you know that, but I'm talking about an explosion within that field. Every bank, every financial institution of any kind has got a bevy of, philanthropic advisors now, and the training is still insufficient. We started several years ago a new activity within the Council on Foundations called the Philanthropic Advisors Services, or Philanthropic Advisors Network of people, and have found a lot of interest in that. Wherever we go, we try to have some kind of a tag-on event for the people in that town in Florida or that place in Georgia or whatever it is, where we can get the people together and say, tell us what your needs are. And again, of course, we're talking to the folks who care enough to come and to turn out to something like that and express themselves, but I think it is a crying need, and not only there, and the lawyers have certainly taken it on the chin a lot, but we have the accounting profession that we've never dealt with before. We've never really had good connections through the accounting profession, and we find that there's great needs there as well. So, there's a lot of work to be done.
The work that TPI has done in this area, led by Steve Johnson, who's here, has looked at really the issue of advisors beyond the lawyers and beyond the accountants to the huge numbers of financial planners, insurance agents, as well as those associated with the financial services. And what Scott said about the lawyers needing to be more, we have found within this group immense lack of understanding of not only the technical aspects, but also the raison d'etre and the reason why one is philanthropic. And thus the whole notion, to an earlier question that came out of Peter's report from our global audience of, is there a public purpose here involved? We don't see that being promoted. We don't see that being really described. So and I think when you then narrow it down to the very tiny group of, quote, philanthropic advisors, of which TPI is, let's say, one and so forth, that's really a very small segment. When it comes to these issues, it is that huge universe. And Stephen Johnson, what's the name of the report you just finished from the Packard Foundation report?
It's called Doing Good by Doing Well in California, the Legal and Financial Advisor's Role.
Is that available?
And that's available online on TPI's website and a subsite entitled Promotion.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to now turn to a new question, which we hope bears some relationship to the one we just dealt with. And once again, we hope this is on your screen. Is it on their screen, Cindy? It's about to be. And the question is, what, in your view, is the single greatest problem doing the most damage to public trust in philanthropy, which we just finished? The second poll question, what are the implications? What are the implications of this loss of trust for philanthropy? Which of the following examples of negative fallout concerns you the most? And we've touched on these, but I notice with some relief we haven't gone into them in depth, so maybe we even got this right. And the elements on this page are more regulation, less autonomy and independence as being a major implication for the loss of trust in philanthropy. Chilling effect on giving. Increased reliance on professionals to limit liability, kind of a depersonalization. Increased caution and timidity on the part of donors and foundation, less risk-taking. Less favorable tax treatment. More regulation, more law that would limit the tax advantages, and then the diminished role of philanthropy, less of a player. Those of you in this room, here at the Immersion Theater in Boston, which one of these leaps out to you as being, in fact, the one that concerns you the most? Do we have a suggestion from the audience as to which one of these is most important? Anyone provide an offering lead from the audience? We have in the front row Mary Phillips.
I would suggest the one that would concern me the most would be a chilling effect on giving. I would be afraid that we would have less formation of private foundations, perhaps more personal giving, but certainly less of a role for private foundations and less numbers of private foundations.
Loss of trust leading to less of a role. How many in the room feel that is in fact the big one? Raise your hands. We have a few. Maybe a third of the room. Any other leap out at you? Any other comment from here in Boston? More regulation, less autonomy, and independence. How many of you would agree that that one is? We have several hands up for that, maybe more than we did from before. Peter G., do we have a compilation? We do not have a compilation
yet. They're deliberating.
They were deliberating.
Here it is. It's up. You want it?
Yep.
Overwhelming winner. Diminished role of philanthropy, parentheses, less of giving. Nearly half. No?
Actually, 44% chilling effect on giving.
That's what I just said. Nearly half.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said
Diminished role of philanthropy. That's what it says. Oh, I see. It's the heading above. Chilling effect on giving. I apologize, Cindy. I read the wrong headline. The right number. Let me
Are we lucky here to have editors or what?
Thank God.
But Mary Phillips, it looks like your comment is what's out in Webland. Any other pieces, Peter? Any other?
No, that's an overwhelming answer. Chilling effect on
chilling
giving.
Effect
nearly
on giving.
half.
Okay, panel, what's your view about this? What are the implications of a loss of trust in philanthropy? What are we really talking about?
I'm gonna jump in if there's a moment of quiet here. I put philanthropy in the same broad general sector as the press. We built this country with the idea that there would be no laws restricting essentially how the press reported the news, and I think it would be equally dangerous to build laws or to rely heavily on regulation to try and cure the ills or the violations of trust in the philanthropic sector. But I think in neither case does that remove the sector's responsibility to be proactive themselves about setting standards, being clear about the standards, setting good examples, and enforcement. And the place, interestingly enough, in their history where both the press and philanthropy have fallen down is that last one, is that tough one on enforcement. The news industry famously rejected a chance to have a news council many years ago, which would be a place you could go with a problem, funded and supported by the industry itself. And up until this period, the philanthropic sector, to my mind, has fallen way short of setting clear standards, of saying enforcement is one of our jobs, and we're going to do it, and we're going to be tough about it. So I think that is the big challenge coming out of all this to the philanthropic sector. And the great danger, of course, is if the sector doesn't itself enunciate clear standards, explain and defend them, and then enforce them, that the temptation for other people to do it will be very great.
I absolutely second everything Peter just said, and I want to point out that we have an example of where that is happening now, and that's within the community foundation movement in this country. For, I think, a whole variety of reasons, and it doesn't really matter what occasioned it, but several years ago, the community foundations in the United States decided that they had to have standards, that they had to have some way of distinguishing themselves as community foundations versus, in some cases, the commercial gift funds and other opportunities that people would have for giving. And so they embarked on what was a very difficult process of standard setting. I know we had a nationwide tour and listened to everybody and so forth. Long story short, there are standards for community foundations, and now they are in the process of implementing peer review. I think they are way ahead of the rest of the field. Our family foundation members and our corporate foundation and corporate giving members are launching similar listening tours beginning this month and lasting through the summer to talk about those standards that distinguish them and the kind of standards that they need to set for themselves. We haven't decided what to do with that, whether they also will engage in peer review or whether there'll be some kind of a platinum, gold, and silver standard for them, or just what, and would welcome hearing opinions from anybody who cared enough to come here today or to tune in to this broadcast has got some thoughts about that. And so if we don't have an opportunity to hear it today, I would sure love to hear about it later.
And you have an opportunity, those of you in our global audience, to write those comments to us, and we hope to include them. John Abley.
There hasn't been a lot of controversy on this panel, so I'll suggest one. In the context, again, of Bill's description of the different types of trust, intent, execution, and then governance, I'm saying in the execution, I question whether the problem of dishonest or unethical trust is the problem. What about competence in achieving the intended goal? And I would even raise a question saying of whatever it is, the $200 billion that is spent in philanthropy in the United States today, my view is that maybe half of that does not fundamentally contribute to society. In fact, maybe it actually creates negative value.
Interesting comment. Did someone clap? I would like to now test the limits of TPI's technology competency when we talk about competence. We're now going to go to Hilary Pearson in Toronto, Canada, and her group around Philanthropic Foundations of Canada that are listening in. And if we do this right, Hilary's going to be able to talk on the phone, and it's actually going to come out in the room. Are we ready, Cindy, for Hilary? Yes. Okay, Hilary, go. Do you have a question from Toronto?
Can I just make the correction that I'm actually in Montreal?
All right. Welcome, Hilary.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this. Canada's a big country. Montreal and Toronto are fairly far apart. And I think, we do have a lot of different views, but I'll try and speak for at least some of my colleagues in Foundation land. For those of you who don't know, I run an association called Philanthropic Foundations Canada, which is a member association for private and family foundations, kind of a subsector of the foundation community. We do have, of course, community foundations in Canada, and we have a separate association for them. But the constituency that I represent is primarily the family and private foundations. And we have been following the debate in the United States with enormous interest because, in a way, for us, it's sort of it's a picture of a potential future. I can say with some, I guess, not satisfaction, but certainly a relief that we don't have the same kind of debate going on in Canada that we have watched in the States, but it could certainly happen to us. And I think what's been instructive for us is watching it happen and watching your reactions to it as it unfolds. Very useful sometimes, most times, to be your neighbor because you generate such interesting ideas that we can immediately borrow. Where Canadians are often in the position of being followers, but that's just because you do such a good job of leading, in some respects anyway. But we won't get into politics. I do want to comment. I find this debate, the panel's discussion, fascinating, and I want to comment in particular on this question of standards because, it is a solution that people are drawn to. It seems to be a solution that speaks to the issue, at least to the extent that in setting standards, one can set up,
Then the other page, the Insta and the other page.
Sorry, am I cutting across someone?
You're doing fine, Hillary. Or did we lose you? I never should have accused her of being in Toronto. Well, that wasn't bad, actually, Cindy. We didn't do too badly. All right.
So my line's just been unmuted. I'm a little worried here about, the sort of editorial voice in the sky. What is it I'm saying? Okay, let me say it fast in case it happens again. This question of standards. We are actually embarking on exactly the same exercise that the Council on Foundations that Dot was just talking about. This summer we're going to be doing a consultation with our membership. We want to get out ahead, we hope, of what might come down the pike at us in terms of a lack of trust in us. Generally speaking, the foundation sector in this country tends it doesn't fly above the radar. There isn't a lot of notice taken of foundations. There is more notice taken certainly of charities, but there's a remarkable degree of trust in charities in this country. I don't have some recent data, but I have some data from a couple of years ago from a survey of charities that was taken across the country. And a phenomenal number of Canadians think that charities are just terrific. More than 3/4 of Canadians trust charities some or a lot. In fact, only nurses and doctors were considered more trustworthy than people who work for Canada's charities. That might have changed in the last couple of years. But the point is that there is a higher degree of trust in general. We don't tend to have the same issues of, scandalous stories about overcompensation of trustees. Our boards, in most cases, our boards are not compensated. That's true of foundations as well. So there tends to be less scandal to write about, which certainly helps. Nevertheless, the question of lack of transparency, secrecy, is certainly a live one. And therefore, we are trying to get out ahead with this consultation process on a set of standards for our foundations, which we hope will set a model for others.
Hillary, do you have a question for the panel that you think might help?
Well, I guess I do have a question because although we are embarking on this effort to set standards, we're doing it with hope, not with certainty, that setting standards will actually make much of a difference. And so my question is standard setting enough? What more can you've talked about education and about the importance of educating people to do their philanthropic jobs better, and I subscribe to that too. But, a standard setting exercise can become actually itself self-defeating, because if you set standards to which people don't adhere or which you cannot enforce, then are they worth the paper they're written on? It's perhaps an open-ended or a rhetorical question, but I'd like to know if people had a comment on that.
I think that's a good question. Thank you very much, Hillary, for joining us, because I think it leads right into our third major area. And our third polling question for both the audience here in the Immersion Theater in Boston as well as our global audience, which is, what do you think is the single most important action that should be taken to rebuild trust in the philanthropic sector? And included in that list in front of you is strengthening governance structures, which goes right to Hillary's question. The other elements that we've suggested could be the single most important action are better defined ethics and best practice standards, more outreach and oversight by the field, raise standards and best practices, more transparency generally, better feedback loops with grantees and the public, investment in accountability, metrics and structures, peer review among foundations, some of these we've already touched on a bit, and then clear job descriptions for trustees and CEOs, which we've touched on a bit, and more oversight by IRS and states. And of course, as all of us in the states know, there are a great many attorneys generals that are filing legislation of one kind or another across the country relevant to these issues. So I'm curious here in the Immersion Theater, would anyone make an offering as to which of these is in fact the single most important element? Do we have from Melinda Marble. Melinda, your vote?
Well, I'm going to go for one that isn't on the list.
Oh, Melinda.
And I come to it because of the way we rapidly dismissed the old boy, old girl network issue here today. I think that all of us in this field operate from our networks. None of us ever feel we're part of the old boy, old girl network, and that's part of the problem. Your old boy network is my group of trusted friends and advisors. And I think if we're talking about the territory that Scott talks about, where we're operating within the law and talking about what is okay, one of our key problems is that as groups of trustees, we tend to stick with our safe and trusted friends who don't tell us it's okay to pay for your daughter's wedding expenses by giving yourself a raise, to give an egregious example. And so I think maybe one of the most important things we could do is think about diversity on our boards, in who we look for advice from, and in who we seek to support. Because I think there is a danger in the kind of trust we have in each other sometimes.
To be consistent with our format, how many of you in the room here in Boston would agree with Melinda as being the single most? We've got some hands up. Tim Hall in the back has a question or has a comment.
Well, I would say that if a major issue is what we talked about before around accessibility and excessive privacy, lack of transparency, that actions that really focus on increasing that transparency would be called for. And there seemed to be a cluster around that. If I had to pick one, I would pick item D, which is better feedback loops with grantees and the public. But I think item C, more transparency generally, and E, strengthening governance and structures. I think this ultimately does get back to the issue of governance, but I think it's sort of the lack of feedback between the institution and its environment that we really need to work on.
How many in the room would agree with Tim's analysis? How many would you raise your hands that he hit it on the nose? We've got some hands up for this too. Is there a last one from Boston? We have one from Ron Ankrum.
Ron Ankrum from Associated Grantmakers. All of these are very useful action steps to take, and my approach would be what comes first, because I think ultimately you need to incorporate most of these that are on here, if not all. And so I would start with A. I think in order to measure things, in order to decide what the structure should be, in order to conduct the kind of monitoring that needs to be out there, in order to do the prosecution, we have to be clear about what those standards are and what people are, how people are supposed to behave and act in the best practices of the field. So I would put A at the top of the list and then line up all of these things underneath there as a part of how you accomplish those ethics and those standards.
How many in Boston like that? I think we've got a number of people who agree with you. Okay, Hal Scheer, last one from the audience. He needs the mic, guys.
It seems to me that no matter which of these you adopt, at the core is really education of your governance, your governing individuals. As we found in the corporate sector, you can have all the structure that you want, but unless your directors are educated as to the best practices that you adopt, it doesn't really matter. And that's much more important than all the regulation and structure that's out there.
How many would agree with Hal? We've got a number of hands up. Okay, Peter G., what do we got from global audience on this one?
It's up.
In the mic.
A little messy. The apparent highest scoring answer is peer review among foundations. Sorry, more transparency generally at 25%. And then you have a cluster of the following. Better defined ethics and best practice, as Mr. Ankrum suggested, better feedback loops with grantees, sounds like what Tim was suggesting, more outreach and oversight by the field. And then it really falls off to very low amounts. So it certainly seems to me there's a clustering amount. I'd like to broaden the menu like Melinda and a couple of the others did and suggest some other tools that may have a role as philanthropies struggle to improve their own practice and use more imaginative tools. One is a user or client survey. And that's when an organization hires somebody to, in effect, go out and review how your own users, grantees, even your vendors, think you're performing. This is something very few foundations do. It's some of them have considered it in the past and been scared of it. Why? Because the results might be public. Fascinating reaction, isn't it? Very simple tool that most businesses would do. We did it once at Rockefeller. It is not nearly as scary as people in the philanthropic field it often is, and it is always enlightening. Number two, I go back, I won't repeat it, but I go back and mention the enforcement commission and mechanism that Dot said the Council on Foundations is working on. I believe in this field in a thing I would call a governance audit, specifically as part of the annual outside audit process. How is the governance being done? And last of all, I would believe in terms of, John Abel, you keep coming back to how the actual mission and program are being executed, and a couple of listeners out there kept saying insistently, you know, mission has to be related to standards. I think a useful thing for many foundations is every once in a while a Team A, Team B approach and have a program critique and free one of the teams from that always burdensome requirement to be balanced, to be fair. Set up a Team A, Team B, and let Team B come in and really rip into the program, not as an answer, but as a little light to shed on things.
Marion?
If I were asked about the list, I would say all of the above, but I would like to address the issue that nobody has, which is greater oversight by the IRS in the states, because I think a lot of what we are seeing right now stems from the failure of the states and the Congress to adequately fund the enforcement programs that we have in place. The IRS provisions now, particularly with the excess benefit transactions, what we call intermediate sanctions, which limit self-dealing on the part of public charities, are excellent standards to assure compliance with what I described as those basic duties of fair dealing and care. The IRS has not received any increased funds for a number of years, while the number of charities has grown markedly, particularly foundations, and they had admitted that they had essentially had to stop auditing foundations because they didn't have the personnel. If we tolerate that, then it's open field for people to look and take advantage, or just assume there are no rules, or that they're not going to pay attention to those rules. In the states, we talk about the attorneys general. We happen to live in a state where we have about as good an enforcement program as there is anywhere. There are only 10 states in which the attorney general's office is empowered and finance to do anything about regulation of charity. So we talk about increasing in the states, but in fact, there, as I say, is that handful, and of those, only 5 of them. Now, admittedly, that includes New York, California, Illinois, Ohio. They do have some activity, but New York works with 20 lawyers and 85,000 charities. Massachusetts works with 22,000 charities and 5 lawyers. You can't do the job. So we need to we cannot ignore the fact that there is a need there. I don't want to talk too long, but I want to just mention also that we have seen in the last 10 years a loosening of the standards of behavior of directors and trustees. The pressure has been, oh, we need to give them protection or they will not serve. It has meant that in many instances, a director is going to be totally protected from any liability. This, in many states, there can be a full liability shield unless you act dishonestly. Now, if you've got that state of affairs coupled with inadequate enforcement, you really have a need to look at what you're doing and why you are assuming that there can be good behavior, because I don't think we can rely totally on self-regulation.
John Aberle.
Question. How big is the problem? Yes, how big is the problem? You had stated a number of 100 criminal cases over the last 5 years. What's the denominator? And maybe 100 isn't right because it's underreported.
I wish I knew. One of the reasons we did the survey was to try to get a feeling for what the extent of the problem is. And clearly, I don't think it's the numbers. I think it is perceptions. And when you get the bad actors and they get a lot of publicity, then you're going to have an overreaction. And that's so that it's the delicate balance that Peter has mentioned, that I mentioned, of assuring freedom of action, but also assuring that there is adherence to basic standards.
Peter, Marion has done an excellent job, and I wanted to make 4 points since, first of all, what I'm doing is a governance audit practice, so I thank you, Peter Goldmark, for reminding people I would be delighted to come and do your governance audit. But I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to make a commercial.
This is, no, Citigroup is very precise about what they want.
I had to say it, though, when he gave that nice, slow curve. The second thing is I would go back to Ron's point that under 3, all of those items are part of a governance review. You cannot have a governance review if you don't have standards and ethics. You can't have education without those things all coming into play. So you need to define it very comprehensively, and I think that does it. But let me go to the third point as one who's been in this oversight role. Believe me, there are no political points to be gained ever in this world for all the assumptions that are being made. I often think, and I will not totally defend Elliot Spitzer in this area, either in the corporate or nonprofit world, except I happen to think he's a pioneer and somewhat of a hero. Because you don't willingly take on the most powerful people in your community to run for governor. You don't take on those who make the businesses. You don't take on the best law firms who defend them. You don't take on the best PR companies unless you have some reason that's substantive and fits within your role. So in the charitable area, this is a very tricky area. Every one of your friends sits on somebody's board of trustees. I mean, you know neighbors, and so it's done very delicately, which then goes to my third point. I'm very pleased that under 2, people did not see the primary implication being regulation, which then leads to more reliance on professionals, which then leads to timidity. I think that regulation cannot be a major concern. But what I would like to see, and maybe Dot can respond to this, the united charitable community, in my experience, has united only twice, really. Once was to stop the Congress from requiring them to spend more money on the 6 or 7% or 5 to 6% of payout. That's when we saw the entire community unite to stop something from happening. I've never seen them unite to support funding for the IRS or for attorneys general, nor to argue for a better delineation of what the public purpose might be here. That is, one of the problems we face is this community rallies to stop things from happening rather than in support of things. Now, that's a natural inclination, but the only other time I saw it was, frankly, around the McCain-Feingold and campaign finance reform was to stop any question that nonprofits ought to be able to operate in a certain way. I understand the First Amendment was involved. I understand lots of other things. But I am concerned here, Peter, when I go back to this, that this enthusiasm we all have for standards, that Hillary asked, for standards, for best practices, it's all wonderful until you come to the rubber hits the road. What's going to be the enforcement mechanism? What's going to be the accountability? How are you going to make people adhere to this? I mean, what's going to be the coercion? And I don't want it to be government. I don't want it to be regulation. But I really think you need something in here to have some degree of teeth in whatever you propose.
Well, Dot Ridings is getting her answer to those 33 questions together. Bill Pounds, would you like to?
I was just going to comment a little bit on what Marion said about the enormity of the task of setting standards and the unlikelihood that public agencies have the capacity or will be given the capacity to do it. I think there's a way to get leverage here, and that is to expect that individual charities outline as precisely as they choose their governance procedures. What are their governance standards? And put it in their annual report. I know many of you are able to withstand the temptation of reading annual reports, but if you read corporate reports these days and proxy statements, they go into great detail in the kind of governance procedures they're going to follow. And that is the result of internal debate, usually by the board, as to what the governance process is, and thereby the board educates itself. Then if you have a widespread number of organizations that outline governance practices, then a group like DOTS can give them grades and choose the 10 best, and you allow the kind of competitive juices to run, and people begin to pull up their socks and develop better corporate guidelines. I think it's had a profound effect on how organizations operate.
Well, you're right. You did ask about 33 questions there. Just a couple of brief reactions. One is that you're absolutely right that this is a very individualistic field that is underlying of all of this. We're seeing, however, that there have been and are times when the community does come together for the greater good. And I'm reminded, I know when Marianne and I both served on the board of Independent Sector, and that was kind of the beginnings of a battle that the charitable sector in general, Independent Sector and the Council on Foundations, joined by a number of other friends in the community, lobbied very hard for the intermediate sanctions legislation. That was for something, not to keep something from happening. And we're lobbying right now for similar related kinds of activities to apply to the private foundation world, which they don't at this point. There have been other examples where certain segments of private philanthropy have come together to work for something. I'm reminded of the work on the Global AIDS Fund, for example, things like that, which are often pass the view. But I'm intrigued by something, and I'm going to mention it because, again, I trust the brilliance of the people in this audience and out there listening to this to come up with some ideas for us as well. You know why the standards are really going to work in the community foundation field? They already are, but they're going to really work. And the reason has been not that we were going to punish them, but they were going to get rewarded for meeting those standards. I won't go into the whole song and dance, but there are things that are available to those community foundations who meet the standards and go through this peer review process that are not available to the rest of those in that field. They're a valuable incentive. Now we're trying to figure out what that, and it already is working. I mean, I'm not just guessing at that. I even see some heads nodding in the audience from people who are in that field. We're trying to figure out what is that incentive then, since we don't, we can't yank anybody's chain. We can continue to work for a form of intermediate sanctions, which I think is very important for this field. But we're also looking for what's the carrot? Where is the, what is that instead of the stick?
Dot, how many members do you have?
2,100.
How many private foundations are there?
Probably about 60,000.
What do we do about that?
now you're going to get me into trouble, aren't you, Peter?
You bet.
Okay.
You didn't come all the way to
There
Boston.
are some very, very small foundations, and I'm not talking in Elliot Spitzer language. I'm talking about very small private foundations that were established. I can't tell you the number right now, but I mean, this is when it hit me. It was several years ago when I was reading the IRS statistics, or no, it was the government, not IRS, but it was the government statistics, that year there were 14,000 non-operating private foundations with assets of less than $100,000. Now, my friends, there's something wrong there. There's some buried in there that are just in formation and they're waiting for the plant to be sold or the, shall we say, the estate to mature. And there's some that are passed through, but that's not the biggest number. The biggest bulk of those who were founded probably on some bad advice and are getting eaten up.
Right. That swings back to this issue of the advisor's role in all this and the culpability of advisors who really do not know what they're doing and are giving advice that's bad. I'm interested whether we have within Boston in the Immersion Theater any questions that people would like to ask. I see some hands up.
Just to those numbers, there's still, if you take that group out, or even some larger group up to 1 million, there's still a large group of foundations that are not being reached, and therefore not, whether it's through the council, maybe this goes back to all the other advisors, that are not being captured. And so how do you, aside from those that probably shouldn't be private foundations, how do you propose reaching the others?
We're going to take some stabs at that through this new initiative we've got going, and I'd be glad to tell you in more depth about that later. But it is an issue, and I think perhaps it would be illustrated by the fact that we have 2,100 members. There are 60,000 private foundations, or thereabouts. Nobody really knows. But our 2,100 members hold about 2/3 of all the assets. So that shows you.
Right. One of the things that TPI has been struck with is the increasing strength of regional associations and the role that they can play in terms of reaching out on a local level. And I think it's our sense it would be a collaborative kind of process with the council, perhaps doing some heavy lifting on all kinds of levels, and the regional associations becoming distributors. And then we also feel there's a major role for community foundations who really are in the access, in the back. Doug Hall.
Hi, I'd like to follow up with what you were saying, Dodd. You mentioned before that we have a lot of recovering journalists on the panel, and I'd like to bring it back to the role of the press on that. I teach in a business school in a university, and it's been interesting to see over the last 10 or 15 years how I think the functioning of business schools has been greatly improved by this phenomenon we have of rankings in major publications. In business schools, we have Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Other nonprofits like hospitals are ranked. The U.S. News rankings are very, very important. And I think what those have done have had the effect of, through feedback from the market, improving the governance of the institution. It improves the management, and I think as a byproduct also has a positive effect on some of the issues that we're talking about today. So just as a specific idea, I guess I'm wondering, A, are there such things as rankings of philanthropic institutions, foundations, especially in major media, not just specialized media for kind of professionals in the area, and might that be something that more mainstream media might play a role in?
It's interesting, Tim. A few years ago, TPI was approached by one of the major weekly magazines, whose name either I can't remember or shouldn't mention, to do just that, to in fact come up with the 25 best and worst for reasons which would take a long time to go over. We declined that opportunity, and we never saw it come together. But I would like to shift a little bit, drawing on some of what has been said so far, and also to give our global audience high marks on their voting. And we really would love those comments to come in on any level you want to deliver them, either as a question or otherwise, for the journal we'll be putting together subsequently. But I think what I had wondered about at some length within the essay on trust is whether, in fact, we have a real issue vis-a-vis the definition of what the public purpose is here, and that so many organizations, foundations, and non-for-profits lose sight of that public purpose as they do the very hard work of trying to define their own goals, their own mission, their own sense of manifest destiny, which of course every organization, every foundation, every nonprofit wants to do. And thus, where is that? And I had wondered about the viability of something called a 360-degree mission, the notion of really looking very carefully at what that role is. And we see this, by the way, not simply from the organized foundation perspective, not from the 60,000, if you will. We see it within individual donors as well, within large donors trying to establish their own sense of how they want to give and how they should give. And to some degree, it swings around to these earlier issues of arrogance, perhaps, of wanting to know. So I would like to pose a question to the panel that they did not know was coming, and it kind of builds on what John Aberle said earlier, which is, are we really doing the kind of job that deserves trust? And I have this little paragraph: we mess around and think in ways that may be creative, but so what? Are we working around the edges of issues? Why are we not outraged more often? Why? And with that, I'd like to turn to the panel to see if we have some response. Alec Jones.
Let me respond as a journalist. First of all, I want to commend the idea of listings, because I think that would, in effect, be a creation of standards that not just the philanthropic world, but the media would also tend to apply as they evaluate, which I think would be probably something useful. On the other hand, I think that what Peter is suggesting is, that's the big rock that I think your sector is worried is going to get turned over, and I imagine it's going to be turned over, because I think that this is really interesting stuff. It involves money, it involves people, it involves in some respects anyway, feet of clay and hypocrisy perhaps, and it's going to make good journalistic inquiry topics. And I think that the sense that you have that the world has changed and that this is going to be an area that's going to be looked at, carefully and probably quite critically is quite correct. And I think that the more organizations like this get ahead of it, have the standards, have the vehicles for saying this is how you should judge us, the better off you're going to be. Because otherwise, the people who are going to be setting those standards are going to be perhaps your worst critics, and they're going to probably be bloggers or other people who have particular axes to grind, and they are going to be the vehicle for setting what standards there are for judging how transparent, how effective, what the mission is, that sort of thing. I think that's something that is more urgent than perhaps even this group believes.
These are compiled, and how well alumni of those schools are schooled and trained to help influence those lists. It causes some trepidation. That's not fatal for me, Alex, because I trust a good independent journalist to see through that and not be manipulated by that. However, what I have not been impressed by is how much most reporters know about philanthropy and foundations. There are a couple of exceptions, but I'm going to make a very strong general statement. I've worked in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the public sector, the press, which I consider a fourth state of government. I've worked in 4 out of the 6 sectors. I have not worked in the religious sector, nor have I knowingly worked in the organized crime sector, which is a very distinct culture.
We'll talk to you later, Peter.
Don Cariff will talk to me later. But I must say the knowledge of even those reporters who have so-called foundation beats really worries me, Mr. Hall, so I'm a little jumpy. I like the general idea But philanthropy is on my list of 4 or 5 areas where I think a lot of America's journalists need some education. And I'm sure people in this panel would love to give it to them.
It's interesting how many of these pieces swing around to education.
I want to agree with Peter. I think he's exactly right. I think it's shocking how ignorant many journalists are about any number of topics, including this. But I think that the best way to educate is to have a clear vehicle for explaining. And I think that the reason that I embrace the idea of the list, I understand the qualms that you have, but I think that it should be a compared to what situation in your minds. It's not that there's going to be nothing. It's that there's probably going to be something far worse, because it would be judging with completely arbitrary standards, and a judging that would be led perhaps by people who are your worst enemies.
John Abley?
As I listened to the comments, it made me think, is there a sort of a Six Sigma process on philanthropy? And of course, there are a number of organizations that do things like that, but they're not all the same. They're very independent, competitive, and the thing that has occurred in corporate governance, for which there is not a similar vehicle, I think, is the major stockholding organizations, CalPERS and TIA, CREF, actually developed their own standards and said to the corporations in which they hold stock, look, here are the standards we ought to do. And it has been, I think, frankly, far more influential than Sarbanes-Oxley. And unfortunately, that means that there's less work to do. But there doesn't seem to be a similar vehicle on that side. Maybe I'm wrong.
Dot?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on this subject of ratings and rankings. I was going to stay out of it, but as a former newspaper editor, I loved rankings. I loved those charts. They were, wonderful attention getters, and they sold papers like crazy. As a non-journalist now, I hate them. I really do, and particularly when you get into things like judging things that are not totally objective. There is no way, I don't see any way, that you could do rankings of foundations that would be worth anything whatsoever and would not just cause a lot of disruption. I really think it has been damaging to a lot of the professional schools. Sorry, Doug, I just think it has been. I have served for 12 years on the Accreditation Committee of the American Bar Association, and I think it's been a disaster of the rankings of law schools have not been good for the profession. I'm sitting now on the Accreditation Committee for Journalism Schools, and the same thing goes. The rankings that are on those somebody else's picked targets, then you teach to the test, and you get a ranking of who's better, and I just don't think it's been helpful or useful or has elevated the field of law or journalism, and certainly not of philanthropy.
Marion, I hear from the audience. Marion.
I think we need to acknowledge that the charitable sector is not protected from tests. We've already mentioned education, but when you look at the role of fundraisers and fundraising and analysis of fundraising, we have had a proliferation of rating organizations in the last 4 or 5 years. Charity Navigator, there's a bunch of them. A number of them use computer generated information and then spew out there. I shouldn't say spew, that's loaded. But they provide rankings and percentage compliance on a bunch of standards that they have taken from numbers that are not totally sensitive to individual situations. And so it isn't that we are immune from this. I think the challenge is to get the organizations that are doing the rating, to better understand what they are doing and better explain the limits. And then the other part of that is explaining it to the giving public.
One of the things that we've observed is that all of those rating systems are based upon data that can be quantified. And we've had discussions, TPI has, with a number of these groups around, can we do a qualitative kind of rating? Can we do a qualitative programmatic analysis? And it gets into really, to some degree, John Abeley's point, what are we doing? Are we really doing anything here? And I think it is extremely complicated. Scott.
Just let me respond to your outrage question. Why aren't we more? And I do want to respond, have people think about that, because John's question really has raised a very interesting thought to me. I mean, how do we account for where this money is going and for what purpose? I mean, governance structures are great, just like due process is wonderful. And it's important. They're fundamental values. We should have them. They should be held accountable. But most of us, I think, believe also in the American value of equal protection or equal justice. That is, what's the outcome as well as this? And we don't want to sacrifice. One could say, Mayor Daley may have done years and years ago a better job of rebuilding Chicago than all the good government types who could just figure out how to process everybody's debt, and we never get anything built. I mean, so there's always that tension. So here's the issue, and Alec has raised it. It's not a question of whether you're going to be rated. It's who's going to do it. I mean, the business community is still reeling from the fact that Business Week in the year 2001 made Dennis Kozlowski their man of the year. And the CFO magazine had the top 4 guys on trial as their CFOs of the year. Now, boards weren't paying attention, somebody wasn't paying attention, but the media feels absolutely burned because they believe what they were told, and they thought, and the business community also, listened to this and said, this is Ralph Nader railing against us, when really it was Paul Volcker, Warren Buffett, John Bogle, all the eminent gurus of the system saying, here's what's wrong. So now we're come to us. We're all sitting here as leaders. We know some things are wrong. We know there are some better ways to do things, and the challenge is how to take it on, not to defend ourselves from the attacks, because they're going to come. So here's my proposal. John Gardner, who I came to know and admire deeply in my last years of his life, talked a huge amount about renewal and the obligations of institutions to renew themselves, to re-examine the Team A, Team B approach. We should be doing the renewal, looking at ourselves and figuring out how do we renew ourselves. And one of the values we ought to think about, which was the independent sector founding as well, was our democracy. Because what we really ought to be outraged about is in the greatest democracy in the world, most of our charitable money is not spent on engagement, mobilization, education about democracy. We have fewer people voting for short and less participation. Now, my outrage, therefore, is simply this. Is it relevant to say, what are we all contributing to our politics, in the best of sense, to our democracy? This is a constitutional democracy, and if 50% of the people eligible to vote don't even take the time to register, if young people don't think about how to participate, if the best we can do in political debate is have 2 parties who sort of reflect the totally middle ground, then where is the third sector, the independent sector, and what is its role in encouraging democratic values, citizen engagement, and, as John Gardner would say, democracy is not a spectator sport, and how do we help people understand the obligations of the office of citizenship?
What I'm struck with, Scott, is the incredible gulf between your really eloquent words, which my guess is this room and our global audience would be completely consistent with, and the actual specific decision-making that goes on day by day, not only in the 60,000 foundations, but in reality in a great deal of giving. And I think that that is the challenge, and how to take the rhetoric that we believe in and ground it is a really a huge leadership issue. And in fact, leadership is going to be the focus of our next Tuesdays at TPI on June 15th. By the way, those of you in our global audience who are beginning to phase out, please do complete the survey instrument that you have. It really would be enormously helpful to us. Peter G.
A strange thing happened when you made your talk about outrage, and then Scott responded, which is a different group of people came onto the line on the web. And another really interesting thing is that many of them are not living. And a sort of lightning flash went across the screen, but I thought I'd just give you a couple of quotes that they've sent in.
Scott,
First
that
one,
was obviously a very powerful speech.
One of them, by total coincidence, is from a man named Gardner, first initial J. And Gardner, first initial J, says, I used to write about leadership, community, and values, and above all, about the renewal of institutions. But in order to do that, and to generate the outrage, and to take on the great issues of our times, you must not fence in an institution with so many rules, so much caution, and so much prudence that the passion dies. Now, the second comment is somebody named Ilvasaker P. And he said, I once wrote that philanthropy is society's passing gear. And I wish I had added that sometimes you've got to cross the double white lines to do it. And the very last comment is from somebody named Churchill, W. I think, Hillary, if you're still with us, he was a great, was it Canadian or somewhere else philanthropist? I'm not sure. And he said, impatience and exuberance and drive are very important things. I was once giving a speech one night, and a political foe of mine got up to introduce me and made reference to the fact that I was a drinker and had consumed a lot of brandy when I led Great Britain during the war, and that, a matter of fact, as my opponent had calculated how much brandy I had consumed, and it had apparently been enough to rise 2/3 up the height of the wall of the auditorium in which I was speaking. To which my reply was that night, and to which I urge all of you to remember how much we all have to do and how little time we have to do it in.
Well, one thing, Peter, I think that the Citigroup Philanthropic Advisors should feel they've gotten their money's worth here if we've got that kind of comment coming in over the web. Immersion theater, do we have some questions for our panel? Here's one from Hal Scheer. Can we get a mic to Hal?
One of my mentors, again, up there somewhere, Bob Miller, said that one of the roles of the overseer or the watcher, that is, who watches the watcher, is to obey the unenforceable. And it seems to me that that's really at a lot of the core of what the panel's been talking about. Do you have any reaction to that?
Comment?
I note that has been the watchword of independent sector of the organization for years, obedience to the unenforceable, which I think is just a classic phrase. It's one I've loved as well.
Independent sector had a committee on ethics and responsibility, and the report it produced more than 10 years ago that was republished this last year has that title, Obedience to the Unenforceable.
I think where that question and those comments are a good introduction to asking our panelists as we wind down this conference, which I think has been really, really great in so many ways, to just comment, each of you, as to what your takeaways have been and what advice or questions you have in your own mind. We'll start with Bill Pounds and go right down the room.
Well, I think the question that naturally arises at the end of discussions like this and at the end of every board meeting is what's going to happen. I think until we take some of these concerns and ideas and convert them into something that actually changes practice, we will not make much progress.
John Aberle.
I, as a foundation, former, if you will, private foundation and kind of venture philanthropy, if you will, I think I'm a little bit more inspired, if you will, about the possibility of really being a bit more proactive, not about what we're doing with our grantees, but in terms of communicating and collaborating with other foundations and challenging them. Because I think as a private foundation, that is a unique obligation as stewards of a resource that we have.
Well, I have always believed that private philanthropy is one of the cornerstones of a functioning and healthy democracy. I say that right all the time. That doesn't mean, democracy is a messy business, And so is philanthropy. And it doesn't mean that I have to like everything that philanthropy funds. There are a lot of things that philanthropy funds that other people have different views of what the public interest is. We didn't really pursue that very much, but I just really want to conclude by saying that I have visitors to my office about once a week, and they're not from the countries that were in on this call. They're mostly from emerging democracies who are coming to ask, how did you in the United States do what you did with private philanthropy? And we have wonderful conversation about that. Obviously, I don't have the answer. I mean, we talk about tax law, we talk about spirit of giving and a whole lot of things, but it energizes me to think that others around the world are recognizing how very central private philanthropy is to the healthy democracy that the United States has enjoyed. And it renews me to think of that and to remind myself that it's not just because it's funding things that I want to see happen or that I want to see problems that I want to see solved, but that we have such a diversity of views on what that is all about, that it comes together into the kind of landscape that democracy is, which is messy, but it is indeed something that ends up being an illustration or a demonstration of what citizen participation can be all about. Whether it's, totally apart from government, totally apart from the private marketplace, it is the human experience.
Thank you, Dot. Scott?
I thank you for the opportunity, and Peter, I want to thank the TPI for doing this. I think it's very important. Here are my takeaways. One is one I came with, which is the need is immense. There are so many people out there who, without so many of you, have no one speaking for them, providing for them, offering them opportunity, meeting needs that otherwise, even if government were performing at a level we all believe it should be. So there's a vital need, because so often it's the voice of people who don't have power that so many groups, foundations, nonprofit groups, private philanthropy deals with and meets their needs. So we must find a way to provide the leadership needed. The second piece is, I think the independent thing is very important. I think in a society that's increasingly dominated, or at least the special interests, which we criticize a lot, but they are simply using democracy. They're in the fray. They learned all the lessons. Peter reminded me, and John Gardner had told them, they learned all the lessons. You don't get out of democracy. You stay in the fray, and you get in there, and that's how in a democracy we set our values and we set our policies. The opportunity is, how do we get the rest of us to understand that people can trump money, that it's not about eliminating the other voices, it's saying the public voice and the public interest ought to be heard as well. So I think this opportunity to figure out how you engage the independent sector actively, and it doesn't have to be in partisan politics, but in the fray, in advocacy, in helping people learn the tools of citizenship, I think continues to be a major, major mission and challenge. But at the end of the day, I still do believe, with Mr. Gardner, as many, many quotes that he's used, but one of the challenges is, how do you get who it gives you the right to stay on the sidelines, he says, to those with privilege and power. And the second is, the challenge of leadership is to convince people that there are golden opportunities masked as insurmountable obstacles. And together, collectively, we can overcome them.
Marion Fremont Smith.
I come away with a renewed sense of dedication to the role of educating people about the importance of the sector and their responsibilities as parts of it. And I view, and I think we should view, the new, quote, attacks and the new light being shed on the sector as not something to be afraid of, but as a wonderful opportunity to mobilize people to the importance of improving practices so that we can, and that is the only way in which we can defend and retain the importance of the sector as a player in our society.
Alec Jones.
I would concur with what Marion said. I think that the fact is that the world is changing for this world of private philanthropy that it has been mostly in the shadows. It's been understood, but it only has been understood in the frame of what it has given money to and what its product has been. I think that's probably going to be changing. And I think that the vehicle for that is going to be, as much as anything, the Internet, which is going to empower an awful lot of people who are going to have their own opinions about how money is spent and what private philanthropy does and so forth. I think that my takeaway would be simply to urge this group to understand that, as has been said by a couple of people, this is as much an opportunity as it is a hurdle. The fact that there's going to be scrutiny is a great lever for reforming, for refreshing, for looking again at what the purpose of private philanthropy is, and for moving private philanthropy in a very positive way. There are going to be, without question, some hits, but I think that if the strategy is to simply avoid being accountable in the media or elsewhere, that's not going to be a strategy that will work and will be, in fact, be quite counterproductive. If, on the other hand, this is embraced as an opportunity to use the scrutiny that's inevitably coming as a lever for making improvement, then I think it could really be a great opportunity indeed.
Peter Goldmark, who may have a new career as a medium.
Look, we all know we live in a world which faces tremendous dangers and challenges, perhaps larger than any generation before us. We also live in a society in which the nonprofit sector has been a phenomenal source historically of new ideas, of innovation, of leadership, of change, sometimes of very shrewd and disciplined planning and foresight as well. It is a sector in our society that other cultures and countries envy. It's one that's not always well understood, but it is a great asset of our culture and our civilization, and its consequences have literally been felt around the world. Now, we live, as various panelists said, in a world where various parts of our society are on trial every once in a while. The corporate sector was recently on trial. In my opinion, they didn't rise to that challenge and that trial very well. Now, I guess the nonprofit sector is on trial. So I come back to where Bill Pounds started this summary, which is what's going to happen. What we have to hope and what we have to work for is that we in the nonprofit sector, as other panelists have said, understand that in some broad, crude sense, it's okay to be on trial, that the bill of indictment will never get it totally right and will never be totally fair. Will never be totally fair. We will be accused of things that we didn't do, and things we did do will go unnoticed. But as a sector, we are on trial to define our standards, to justify our mission, and to re-earn our trust, which is what we came forward here today. And I hope and I pray, for the sake of both this country and for our chances as a human species to fare well over the next 20, 30 years, I hope and pray we're up to that trial.
Those are wonderful concluding words, panel, all of you, and I want to thank you enormously for being here. I want to urge our global audience to please complete the survey, and those here also in the Immersion Theater in Boston. I think we did what we hoped we'd do in many ways, and for us at TPI, it has led us to select as the next theme for the June 15th Tuesdays at TPI, the meaning of philanthropic leadership. And we'll address on that day the questions: how does philanthropy enable powerful visions to become practical strategies for leadership? How can philanthropy become a true moral leader in the affairs of the world in which we live? Why has philanthropy failed too often to take on needed leadership to move an issue forward? And what are the real-world implications of these questions for donors, for trustees, as well as foundation CEOs and professional staff? We thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, panel.